In a country that swears justice is blind, a white cop accused of brutality smirks at the bench because a judge is a black woman. "People like you don't get to judge me," he spits, loud enough for the jury to hear. Years of protected violence sit on his record like medals. But today, under the fluorescent glare of a federal courtroom, he reaches for something deadlier than his words. The shot he's about to take could shatter more than wood and glass. It could rip open America's oldest wound. Where are you watching this from? Comment below, and don't miss the ending. The morning sky over Charleston was a slate-gray canvas, the kind that presses down on the city with a quiet weight, as though it, too, understood the gravity of what was about to unfold within the hallowed halls of the federal courthouse. Outside, the air was thick with anticipation, mingling with the sharp tang of coffee and the occasional flare of protester chants. A chain-link fence separated two sharply opposed worlds. On one side, a cluster of police supporters waved placards reading "Back to Blue," their faces tight with pride and defiance. On the other, a sea of demonstrators brandished signs declaring "Justice for all," their voices raw with anger and grief, demanding accountability that had long been postponed. The divide in the crowd mirrored a rift that ran deeper than the courthouse walls could contain, stretching through neighborhoods, workplaces, and dinner tables across the region. Inside, the courtroom was a study in restrained authority. Judge Marissa Cole, a woman whose presence demanded respect before she even spoke, sat poised behind the bench. Her dark skin glowed under the soft, institutional lighting, and her gaze cut through the tension like a scalpel, precise and unyielding. Today, the burden she carried extended beyond the verdict of a single man. It weighed on her shoulders as a symbol of justice for a system too often criticized for failing those it was sworn to protect. The defendant, Brian Kessler, entered the room with a swagger that seemed almost choreographed, his white uniform crisp, his badge gleaming, his eyes glinting with an arrogance that made those watching involuntarily recoil. For some, he had been a hero, a decorated officer celebrated in suburban neighborhoods where the sun shone brightly over picket fence lawns. Yet for others, his very presence was a reminder of systemic failures, a figure whose actions and words had sown fear and resentment. As he strode toward the defense table, his gaze lingered on Judge Cole, a silent, unapologetic challenge in the tilt of his chin and the narrowness of his eyes. There was no smile, no pretense of contrition, only a quiet, simmering confidence that seemed to dare the court to question him. Jordan Lee, the federal prosecutor, adjusted her notes and took a measured breath. The words she would speak could ignite this courtroom, spark outrage, or force reflection. When she began, her voice was steady, resonant, and unflinching. She reminded the room that this trial was not merely about one man's conduct, but about the pattern, the culture, the choices that had allowed violence to seep through the very institutions sworn to serve the public without prejudice. Outside the courtroom, the divided crowd's chants carried faintly through the reinforced walls, a low hum that seemed almost to seep into the judge's chambers and the minds of everyone present. Some of the reporters began whispering into microphones and phones, recounting Brian Kessler's former accolades, how he had once been considered a pillar of heroism in white suburban communities. The irony was palpable. Here stood a man celebrated as a protector, now facing scrutiny for acts that had drawn him into infamy elsewhere. The tension in the room was not merely legal. It was social, racial, moral, and historical, a combustible mixture that seemed to vibrate in the polished wood and brass fittings of the courtroom. Then, like a spark thrown onto dry kindling, the first piece of evidence that would set the tone for the trial was read aloud, a message leaked from Brian Kessler's personal phone. The words were stark, unfiltered, and laden with racial contempt. "Some people just don't belong here," it read, the sentences simple yet devastating in their implications. A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. Murmurs erupted as some faces went pale, while others tightened in anger. This was not an abstract allegation or hearsay. It was a direct, personal window into man's mindset, a confirmation of the fears that had lingered in communities for years. Judge Cole's expression did not change, though her eyes lingered just a moment longer on Kessler, who now seemed slightly less untouchable, his previous poise replaced with a flicker of unease. Security personnel, trained to remain invisible in moments of tension, shifted imperceptibly in their seats, aware that the equilibrium of control in this courtroom had begun to tilt. Defense attorney Patrick Doyle, a seasoned litigator with a reputation for navigating impossible odds, shot a brief, tight look at his client, then whispered something that went unheard by the public, but which seemed to offer the faintest balm to Kessler's fraying confidence. The courtroom itself seemed to hold its breath. Photographers and journalists positioned at the back-angle cameras that captured every twitch, every furrowed brow, every micro-expression. Their pens moved rapidly, recording the tension, the juxtaposition of privilege and accountability, the fragile theater of justice teetering on the edge between performance and verdict. And outside, the chants and placards seemed louder than ever, a constant reminder that this was not merely a private confrontation, but a public reckoning, mirrored in communities fractured along the lines of history and heritage. As Jordan Lee presented the opening argument, she wove a narrative that was as much about systemic patterns as it was about individual choices. She spoke of communities that had suffered under a shield meant to protect them, of trust betrayed by those entrusted with authority, and the cascading consequences when prejudice found safe harbor behind a badge. Each phrase was deliberate, calculated to leave no room for doubt, no space for the courtroom or the watching nation, to dismiss the significance of the trial as just another legal proceeding. Kessler's posture stiffened. He shifted in his seat, adjusting his tie, gripping the edge of the table as though it could anchor him against the tidal wave of scrutiny washing over him. There was a perceptible tension in the air, the sort that made even the most seasoned observers, security, journalists, attorneys, hold themselves just slightly more rigid, aware that the unfolding drama was about more than the reading of charges or the presentation of evidence. It was about confrontation with historical truth, with society's unspoken grievances made suddenly, unavoidably explicit. Then, the courtroom collectively absorbed another jolt of reality. The first witness was called, stepping up with a gait that carried both resolve and trepidation. Judge Cole's gaze remained unwavering, a silent signal that the court demanded honesty, courage, and above all, accountability. The murmurings outside, the chants, the camera shutters, the whispers, felt almost like a distant storm compared to focused intensity inside. Here, the stakes were both immediate and symbolic. The witness would testify, the court would listen, and a system under scrutiny would either bend toward justice or reveal its fractures in stark relief. The collective weight of history, expectation, and public scrutiny pressed down, and yet Judge Cole's eyes never wavered. She held them on Kessler with a quiet, relentless intensity, a reminder that this courtroom was a stage where pretense would fail, where truth would be demanded not merely for the sake of procedure, but for the moral integrity of the society that had long been watching, often in silence, often in pain. This is not just a trial of one man. The atmosphere seemed to declare, heavy with unspoken implications, but the trial of an entire system. And with that, Judge Cole gestured toward the witness stand, her motion clear and unwavering, inviting the first voice of accountability to rise. Ray confront the man who had once walked freely under guise of heroism, now confronted by the weight of evidence, scrutiny, and the relentless gaze of justice. Cole's eyes fixed on the defendant, sharp and immovable, a silent promise that the court would see everything clearly. With that look, the first witness stepped forward, and the trial officially began. The fluorescent lights in courtroom 2B cast an unforgiving glow, sharp and direct, as though the overhead fixtures themselves demanded truth. They fell in bright, narrow cones onto the witness table, illuminating every twitch, every half-smile, and every bead of sweat that formed under pressure. Shadows stretched across the walls, exaggerated by the harsh angles, making the room feel simultaneously larger and more claustrophobic, as if the very architecture conspired to press every secret into visibility. Judge Marissa Cole sat upright, her hands folded on the polished wood bench, eyes fixed with surgical precision on the unfolding scene before her. Today, the weight of accountability seemed to press down with particular intensity. This was not merely a procedural proceeding, but a test of whether the facade of authority could withstand scrutiny. At the center of that scrutiny was Brian Kessler. His posture remained deceptively relaxed, but the faint twitch in his jaw betrayed a mind bristling with calculation. Across the aisle, the prosecutor Jordan Lee reviewed her notes, sharp and methodical, preparing to dismantle, piece by piece, the armor of credibility Kessler had worn for years. The courtroom was silent save for the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the distant murmur of reporters outside, waiting to capture every inflection, every gesture that might define the narrative. Allison Park, the forensic analyst, approached the witness stand with a quiet confidence that belied the storm her testimony was about to unleash. Her presence was understated yet commanding. She carried with her the authority of evidence that refused to bend to charm or intimidation. After taking the oath, she began methodically, her voice clear and unwavering, outlining the inconsistencies in Brian Kessler's official report. The first detail she revealed was seemingly minor, a mismatch between the Times log and radio dispatches and the timeline Kessler had reported. But in a courtroom weighted with tension, minor details often became a fulcrum of major revelations. The dispatch logs indicate Officer Kessler was on a different call at 8:17, Allison said, her eyes scanning the courtroom to ensure her words carried their full weight. Yet the incident report states he arrived on scene at that exact time. The overlap is impossible unless records were altered or misreported. She paused, letting the implications settle. The murmurs in the courtroom were immediate but contained. Journalists jotted furiously. Security officers leaned slightly forward, and even Judge Cole allowed a fraction of breath to escape before restoring her signature composure. Then came the body cam footage, a segment that had been tampered with. Allison's presentation included a carefully annotated video clip that exposed subtle edits, missing seconds, abrupt jumps, inconsistencies in angle and timing. The footage, once thought to be objective and irrefutable, now revealed the possibility of deliberate manipulation. The room seemed to grow heavier with each frame projected onto the courtroom screen. It was a quiet, devastating weight, the kind that forces even the most hardened observers to reevaluate what they had accepted as fact. Brian Kessler's reaction was immediate and visceral. He leaned back, letting a low murmur escape his throat. "It's all fabricated," he muttered, loud enough for reporters to catch. Then, almost theatrically, he turned toward the press gallery, curling his lip into a sharp, mocking smile. "All lies. Nothing but lies," he repeated, as if repetition might convince someone, anyone, that the world itself had conspired against him. His gaze locked with cameras, with journalists, daring them to question his narrative, to pierce the armor of authority he had worn for decades. Judge Cole's eyes narrowed, and her voice rang out with calm authority. "Silence in the courtroom," she commanded, her tone carrying both warning and moral weight. "This is not a stage for provocation." Kessler's response was a chuckle, dark and mirthless. "If you were a real judge," he said, his voice slicing through the room with casual contempt, "I wouldn't be sitting here at all." His words were not merely defiance. They were a gauntlet thrown at the principles Cole represented. It was the sort of brazen, systemic arrogance that had fueled frustration and distrust in communities far beyond the walls of this courthouse. The entire room seemed to inhale sharply, the tension almost palpable, a brittle filament ready to snap under scrutiny. For a moment, the courtroom felt suspended in time. The weight of public expectation, historical grievance, and the personal consequences for everyone present seemed to hang in the air. Allison remained calm, her hands steady on her notes, unshaken by Kessler's theatrics. Patrick Doyle, the defense attorney, adjusted his tie, the faintest hint of unease crossing his composed exterior. Even the security detail straightened, eyes flicking from the defendant to judge, a silent acknowledgement that what they were witnessing was more than procedural. It was elemental. The prosecution leaned into the moment, highlighting that Kessler's dismissive smirk did not just represent an individual's arrogance, but mirrored a broader culture of impunity. This is a man who believed he could rewrite reality to suit his narrative. Jordan Lee said, "Her words deliberate, precise." The evidence before this court demonstrates that truth and accountability were secondary considerations to maintaining the illusion of authority and control. The room felt smaller somehow. Every witness, attorney, and observer tethered to the gravity of the accusation, to the stark reality of what systemic failure could look like when embodied in a single figure. Brian shifted in his seat, trying to regain composure, but the cracks in his public persona were beginning to show. His confident smirk faltered as Allison moved into the finer points of her report. Gaps, contradictions, timestamps that defied explanation, and digital footprints that could not be erased. Each revelation chipped away at the veneer of control he had relied upon for years. The courtroom had become a lens, a magnifying glass through which not only his actions but his credibility were being examined, analyzed, and publicly questioned. And yet, Kessler remained defiant, his tone dripping with sarcasm as he murmured under his breath, "This is nothing but theater." The words, intended as dismissal, instead underscored the stakes. He had underestimated the rigor of truth and the resolve of those committed to exposing it. Judge Cole's eyes met his again, unblinking, unyielding, a silent promise that theatrics would not suffice, that performance would never substitute for accountability, and that this trial was bigger than ego. It was about justice in its raw, unflinching form. As Allison concluded her testimony, the courtroom exhaled collectively, though the tension remained taut. Every eye seemed to linger on Kessler, every journalist pen poised for the next act of unfolding drama. His defiance was no longer a shield, but a warning sign of the battle yet to come, a foreshadowing of the dangerous confrontations that would erupt as the trial continued. Jordan Lee's hand rose, signaling the next step in the prosecution strategy. A brief glance at Judge Cole was enough. The signal was clear, precise, authoritative. The next witness, someone who had worked closely with Brian Kessler, would now take the stand, ready to testify, ready to confront not just a man, but the deeper cracks in the badge that he represented. The tension did not ease. It only thickened, a reminder that this trial was as much about culture and conscience as it was about law. The courtroom, with its stark lighting, its silent anticipation, and the weight of every word spoken, felt like the epicenter of a reckoning long overdue. And with that, the stage was set for the next chapter, an examination of allegiance, loyalty, and the uncomfortable truths lurking behind the blue uniform. The prosecution called the next witness, someone who had worked alongside Kessler. The air in courtroom 2B felt dense enough to grip, a pressurized hush that absorbed each shuffle of paper and the soft scrape of shoes against polished marble. When Sergeant Ramon Cruz took the stand, the light above the witness box carved him into clarity. Square shoulders, clipped mustache, hands that seemed more comfortable gripping a steering wheel at 3 a.m. than resting on a Bible. He looked out over the room once, not to measure it, but to steady himself against it. Judge Marissa Cole nodded for him to proceed. At the prosecution table, Jordan Lee's pen hovered, already primed to stitch his testimony into the narrative she had been building since the first gavel strike. Across from her, Patrick Doyle leaned back just enough to signal nonchalance, though his eyes gave away calculation. He knew a former colleague could do damage that paperwork never could. "Sergeant Cruz," Lee began, voice level, "how long did you serve with the Eden County Police Department?" 14 years, he said, the words flat with habit. "And did you work alongside the defendant, Brian Kessler?" "I did. For years in the same precinct, 2 on the same shift. We rode together on detail more times than I can count." Lee nodded, easing the room toward the fault line. "In 2019, did you file an internal complaint concerning Officer Kessler?" Cruz's eyes flicked to Kessler, then to the judge. He drew a breath, not dramatic, not labored, just careful. "Yes, ma'am." "What did that complaint allege?" "That Officer Kessler used excessive force during a stop involving a black teenager. We responded to a noise call behind a strip mall. The kid was 18, skinny as a pool cue. Kessler took him down with a knee to the neck before the boy even finished putting his hands up. A ripple moved through the gallery. Press pen scratched faster. A small cough died halfway to the surface. Doyle shifted, readying an objection that didn't arrive. Lee let the silence gather its own momentum. "And what happened to your complaint, Sergeant?" she asked. "It was not sustained. I was told there wasn't sufficient evidence and that my recollection might be influenced by recent media hysteria." He paused, bitterness flattening the vowels. "The captain said I should be a team player. Did you push back?" "I did," Cruz said. "I asked for the body-worn footage to be preserved. I was told the camera malfunctioned." He let the words hang. "Funny thing, when promotions came up 6 months later, my name wasn't on any list anymore." From the defense table came a quiet exhale that could have been a laugh. Kessler's mouth bent into a sideways smile, as if he were listening to a story about someone else, someone less competent, less inevitable. The expression didn't last. Cruz kept speaking. "I saw a pattern," he said. "Not one night, not one kid. A pattern. Young, black. Fits the description. He'd escalate, then write reports that made the escalation look like compliance. The paperwork never bled. Doyle rose. Objection, Your Honor. Speculation as to patterns and intent. Judge Cole turned her gaze on Cruz. Sergeant, confine your answer to incidents you personally witnessed. Yes, Your Honor. Cruz said, what I witnessed was enough. Lee advanced a step, her voice tightening just a degree. Did you face retaliation? Depend what you call it, he said. Shift change without notice. Paperwork bounced back over commas. I got assigned a desk duty the day I was scheduled for tactical training. Nothing direct, just enough to make you decide to quit talking. And did you? No, he said. I kept the notes. Every time the complaint system told me the camera failed, I wrote down who told me and when. He glanced at the prosecution table. You have copies. A low murmur skated the back wall. A bailiff's stare iced it over. Brian Kessler's chair scraped. He leaned forward, knuckles whitening on the table's edge. This is theater, he muttered, not under his breath so much as through it. Guy's been sore since he washed out of the unit. Lee didn't look his way. She had the room. Sergeant, did anyone in command acknowledge your concerns? One lieutenant said, this isn't the time to question a decorated officer. Another told me, you don't want to be the guy who tanks morale. Judge Cole watched Kessler's reflection in the polish with like a second witness. His jaw worked. The quiet coil of a man used to being the loudest thing in any room. When Cruz mentioned the neck restraint, Kessler's lips parted around a smile that wasn't joy. Doyle rose again. Your Honor, I request these characterizations be stricken. They go to notice and credibility, Lee countered. The department knew. Cole weighed them with a look. The testimony stands. The jury will evaluate weight. Cruz's hands tightened around the edges of the witness stand, not with fear, but with the discomfort of telling an ugly truth inside a room built for the polite version. It wasn't just the stops, he said. It was the talk, the texts. He'd say, these kids only understand force. He'd say, clean neighborhoods need clean streets. You learn to hear the words that aren't said. Kessler laughed, one sharp note. He turned to the press row, eyes lit like he'd found a friendly lens. You people love this, don't you? Eat it up. Ex-cop throws his brothers on the bus, makes headlines for a day. Judge Cole's gavel tapped once. Mr. Kessler, you will remain silent unless addressed. He smiled wider. If you were a real judge, I wouldn't be sitting here at all. The room inhaled as one. A bailiff's hand hovered near his radio. Another took half a step toward the defense table. Cole didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Mr. Kessler, one more outburst and you will be removed. Kessler stood halfway. A violent scrape of chair legs announced his height. Say the quiet part out loud, Your Honor, he said, eyes burning into hers. You're not after justice. You're after a white cop's head. You want to make an example. You want to prove something to your people. The sentence fell like a blunt instrument. The room's temperature dropped. Someone in the third row swore under their breath. The bailiff's warning glare froze at midair. Doyle's hand clamped on Kessler's sleeve, a tug disguised as counsel. Sit down, he hissed. Cruz didn't flinch. He looked at Kessler the way you look at a familiar street sign you wish you never learned to read. I put my badge on the line to report you, he said, tone steady. I didn't do that for headlines. I did it because if we're not clean inside, none of this means anything. Lee held the beat, then stepped closer to the witness. Sergeant, one last question. Why speak now? Because the cameras are working, he said. Because my notes didn't get lost this time. Because the kid behind that strip mall still calls me sometimes just to say he sleeps through the night now. He paused. Because the department didn't listen in 2019, and someone needs to hear it in 2025. Kessler's chair legs thudded back to the floor. He sat, but not from obedience, from calculation, recalibrating rage into something with edges. The jurors watched him not as a badge, not as a headline, but as a man placed squarely inside the frame Cruz had drawn. It wasn't a flattering fit. Judge Cole regarded the room as if she could smooth it back to its lines by will alone. What she saw instead was exactly what the country had been seeing for years. Procedures the color of sunlight and practices the color of shadows, overlapping until you no longer knew which told the truth. The tension didn't burn off. It thickened, the kind of pressure that announces itself before anyone names it. The court reporter's fingers stuttered, then caught rhythm again. Security's boots planted a fraction wider. Doyle's jaw settled into a defensive hinge. Lee's pen clicked once, a tiny metronome marking the tempo of a reckoning. No one knew that the next time he stood up, it wouldn't be only to speak. Cole's gaze shifted the perimeter, a fraction sharper. She gave a small, unmistakable nod to the bailiffs. Watch him. Watch the room. Do not blink. It was a move of a judge who has seen bravado turn into something with mass and velocity. "Thank you, Sergeant Cruz," she said at last. "You may step down." Lee glanced at her witness list, then at the jury, then at Kessler. The line held. The story did not. It was moving now, and everyone in the room felt the floor tilt. Cole signaled for security to be on guard, but he had no idea what was about to happen. The ticking of the courtroom clock had never felt so loud. Each click of the second hand ricocheted through the heavy air, like a warning no one could decipher, until the sound was swallowed whole by something sharper. A sudden scrape of metal, the whisper of fabric pulled too quickly, and then the glint. Cold steel emerging from beneath Brian Kessler's jacket. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The shape of the pistol seemed to consume the entire space between him and the bench. Conversations in the gallery cut off mid-syllable, and the rustle of papers froze mid-air. Then the recognition hit. First in the widening eyes of the court reporter, then in the tightening stance of the nearest bailiff, and finally in the sharp inhale that rippled through the press row. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. Kessler's arm leveled with deliberate precision, the muzzle locking on Judge Marissa Cole as though there were no one else in the room. "Don't move," he said, voice low but threaded with violence that didn't require volume. His stance was calm, too calm, and that stillness was somehow more dangerous than rage. A chair tipped over in the back, crashing against the tile. Someone cried out, a woman's voice breaking high, and in that echo, panic threatened to bloom. A few in the gallery ducked instinctively, pulling others with them. The sharp screech of metal legs against the floor marked the collapse of order. But Cole didn't flinch. She didn't lean back or raise her hands. Instead, she held his gaze the way a surgeon holds a scalpel, steady, knowing the next cut might decide everything. Her voice, when it came, was quiet enough to make him lean in, which was precisely the point. "Mr. Kessler," she said, each word landing with the weight of a gavel. "You just confirmed every word that's been spoken about you in this courtroom." It was an indictment sharper than any legal argument Lee could have drafted. A flicker crossed Kessler's eyes, half irritation, half acknowledgement. Then came the smile, slow and joyless. "You think this is about your case?" he asked. "No, Judge. This is about control. My control." He gestured with the gun, a quick snap that made the front row of the jury instinctively flinch. Everyone down, on the floor, now. Patrick Doyle, pale but still seated, raised his palm slightly. "Brian." "Shut it," Kessler barked without turning his head. "You had your turn to talk. Now it's mine." Across the aisle, Jordan Lee remained motionless, eyes on the barrel but mind working behind the stillness. She could see the bailiffs out her peripheral vision, two at the edges of the gallery, frozen between duty and the fear of triggering a shot. They were close enough to act if the angle shifted. Not yet. The room began to obey. Slowly, reluctantly, people slid from benches to floor, the sound of shuffling shoes mixing with muffled sobs. The jury clustered together, heads ducked, some hands trembling as they clutched the hem of the rail in front of them. Reporters, pressed flat against the ground, kept their eyes locked on the scene, recording every moment with a clarity that felt almost obscene. Cole still hadn't moved. "You want them to see you as in control?" she asked, her tone a deliberate mix of calm and challenge. "All they'll see is a man proving exactly why he's here. You're writing the ending yourself." The words made something hitch in Kessler's expression, a shadow of doubt quickly smothered. "The ending's mine to write," he said, and the gun didn't waver. Every person in that room knew how fast this could change. The tension was a living thing, crawling under skin, filling lungs until each breath felt rationed. Kessler's finger rested alongside the trigger, not yet committed, but too close for anyone to mistake his intent. Judge Cole could hear the faintest noise from beyond the double doors at the rear of the courtroom. A floorboard creak? No, more deliberate than that. The faint vibration in the air, almost imperceptible unless you were listening for it, like the sound of boots moving in practiced unison. Inside, Lee shifted her weight a fraction, drawing Kessler's eyes for just a second. Doyle's gaze flicked toward the gallery entrance, then back to the gun, his own breath shallow. The bailiff's hands twitched. Subtle, but ready. "Here's how this is going to go," Kessler said, his voice carrying over the bent heads of the jurors. "You," he pointed the gun at Lee, "are going to tell the cameras I'm being framed. You," he jabbed it toward Doyle, "will confirm it. And you, back to Cole, will declare mistrial and walk me right out of here." Cole didn't break eye contact. "You're asking for something you can't have without leaving a trail of destruction behind you. And if you think anyone outside that door is going to let you walk, you're wrong." His smirk deepened. "That's why we're going to make sure I leave before they get here." But the truth was, the clock was already working against him. Every second he stood, there was another second the outside forces had to prepare. The soft, rhythmic thump from beyond the courtroom grew clearer now. Boots hitting tile in near silence. A slow encirclement. The kind of movement that never rushed because it never needed to. No one inside the room said the word, but they all knew what it meant. Beyond that door, another force was drawing closer with every measured step. The SWAT team was already in the building. The SWAT team quietly took positions around the courthouse. The air inside the sealed courtroom was thin, stretched taut like a wire ready to snap. Every breath seemed amplified, every rustle from the jury box a reminder of how dangerously close the edge was. Overhead, the cold fluorescence of the ceiling lights washed the room in an unforgiving pallor, making the pistol in Brian Kessler's grip gleam with a metallic chill. His knuckles were pale around the handle, the weight of the weapon steady, his finger dangerously close to the trigger. Judge Marissa Cole didn't shift in her seat. Her voice, when she spoke, was deliberate, neither a command nor a plea. It was something far more unsettling to a man like Kessler, an attempt to understand him out loud. "Mr. Kessler," she began, each word wrapped in a calm that was almost surgical. "I'm not going to ask you to put the gun down. Not yet, because I know what happens when someone tells you what to do. You push back. You see it as a challenge to your authority." The muscles in his jaw flexed, a small tick betraying the hit her words had landed. Around them, the audience was frozen into silence, some with their heads down, others unable to look away. The bailiff stayed rooted, eyes flicking between Cole's steady face and the dangerous line of the gun barrel. "You've built your life on control," Cole continued, her tone slipping lower, pulling him into the sound of her voice. "On the badge, the uniform, the authority it gave you over every street you walked. You wore it like armor. But armor works both ways. It protects you and it traps you inside." His expression hardened, but there was something in the way his eyes twitched, something less certain than before. "You remember the Martin Street fire?" Cole asked suddenly. Her words caught him off guard, making him blink. 7 years ago, the night you carried a boy out of a burning apartment. He couldn't have been more than 9. Black kid. His mother never stopped thanking you. You remember his name? Kessler's lips parted, almost imperceptibly. "Tyrone," he muttered, so quietly it could have been mistaken for a breath. "Yes," Cole said, not breaking eye contact. "Tyrone, you risked your life for him. No hesitation. No questions about the color of his skin. You didn't ask if he deserved saving. You just saved him." A ripple moved through the gallery, a shifting of weight and breath as the memories settled in the air. Kessler's eyes flickered, anger softening into something less defined. "So tell me," Cole pressed, her voice still low, but with a sharpened edge now, "what happened to the man who saved Tyrone? Why did you choose this?" She nodded toward the gun in his hand. Why turn the same hands that carried him to safety into weapons against people like him? Kessler's breathing deepened. For the first time, his stance seemed less unshakable. The grip on the pistol loosened. Barely, but enough for the trained eyes in the room to notice. His gaze darted between Cole, the jury box, and would grain to the floor, as though searching for the ground beneath him. "You think you know me," he said finally, the bite in his tone diminished by the uncertainty creeping into it. "You don't. You've never had everyone looking at you like they're just waiting for you to fall." Cole didn't miss the opening. "And you've never had to walk into a room already guilty in their eyes because of the skin you were born in," she replied, her words cutting without rising in volume. "Your fear of losing power doesn't compare to living without it your whole life." The room felt heavier. The gun didn't waver much, but its threat had shifted. Less the product of pure rage now, more of a man grappling with something he couldn't name. "I'm not your enemy, Brian," Cole said. "But right now, you're proving to everyone here, including yourself, that the people who accuse you were right. You want to walk out of this room as the man who once saved Tyrone, or as the man who destroyed whatever was left of him?" For a fraction of a second, the silence was almost merciful. It seemed like the question might land deeply enough to tip the balance. Kessler's eyes glistened not from tears, but from the effort of holding something back. His finger hovered, still close enough to the trigger to keep every heart in the room suspended. Outside, faint and muffled, there was movement, boots brushing against marble, the soft metallic whisper of equipment shifting. The SWAT team was in place, their presence pressing in like an invisible tide. Cole saw the slight tremor in Kessler's wrist. Her next words came slower, stretched out as if each syllable could widen the space between impulse and action. "You're at a crossroads right now, Mr. Kessler. One road ends in sirens and headlines. The other, maybe it's the first step back to the man you were. But you can't stand here forever." His breath caught. The gun dipped. Only slightly, but enough for a collective intake of breath from the gallery. The bailiffs tensed, every muscle primed. Cole didn't look away, her voice threading through the distance like a lifeline. And then the doors to the courtroom burst open as SWAT took the order. The heavy oak doors slammed open with force that echoed off the marble walls, snapping the tension like a wire. In a single coordinated surge, the SWAT team poured into the room from two flanking entrances, black armor and matte helmets slicing to the haze of dread that had settled over the gallery. The scent of gun oil mingled with a faint tang of fear in the air. For a heartbeat, it was unclear their arrival would tip the scales toward salvation or catastrophe. Brian Kessler's eyes darted, catching the movement at the periphery. His finger twitched once, then committed. The deafening crack of the gunshot tore through the room, drowning out the gasps and shouts. The bullet screamed past Judge Marissa Cole's face, so close she felt the sudden heat of it kiss her cheek before it slammed into the mahogany of the bench behind her, splintering the polished surface. For half a second, time fractured. Cole did not flinch. The stillness of her posture was almost more shocking than the bullet itself. But the spell broke with a roar of commands. "Down! Down! Drop it!" The SWAT leader's voice thundered as boots pounded against the hardwood. From the left flank, Officer Marcus Reed, broad-shouldered, visor down, movements honed by years of tense entries. Close the gap first. His trajectory was pure precision, the kind born of both training and the simmering knowledge of who exactly stood before him. Brian had once spat words at Marcus in a precinct hallway, the kind that burrowed deep under skin and stayed there. Words about quotas, diversity hires, and the supposed weakness of a black man in uniform. Marcus had never forgotten. Brian barely had time to register the man bearing down on him before Marcus's shoulder hit him square in the chest. The gun clattered to the floor, skidding under the first row of spectator benches. Another SWAT officer pinned Brian's legs while Marcus twisted his arms behind his back with practiced efficiency. The zip ties hissed closed, cutting off the last physical symbol of Brian's control. "You remember me now?" Marcus's voice was low, almost drowned by the chaos, but the venom in it was unmistakable. Brian didn't answer. His face was pressed to the cold floor, jaw tight, breath shallow with fury and humiliation. In the gallery, a woman sobbed softly while another muttered a prayer. The reporters, frozen moments ago, were now scribbling furiously, cameras clicking like distant thunder. The bailiff spread out, corralling the crowd toward the exits to prevent anyone from surging forward. Cole rose slowly, her gaze sweeping the wreckage. Splintered wood, a discarded weapon, the metallic taste of adrenaline still hanging in the air. Her cheek stung faintly where the bullet had grazed by, but her voice, when it came, was steady. "Secure the weapon," she instructed, as if the room hadn't nearly seen a killing. "Clear the court." The SWAT leader gave a quick nod, his team moving in disciplined choreography. Brian was hauled to his feet, wrists bound tight, shoulders pushed forward by Marcus's unyielding grip. The contrast between the two men was stark, not just in the color of their skin, but in the way one stood upright with unshaken purpose, while the other was forced to stumble. Stripped of the authority he once wielded like a weapon. Reporters shouted questions as Brian was let out, about the shot, about his motives, about what this meant for the trial. None were answered. The moment for words had passed. Now it was evidence, testimony, and consequence that would speak. When the last spectator was gone and the SWAT team had withdrawn, Cole allowed herself one quiet exhale. She ran her fingers briefly over the gouge in the bench where the bullet had struck, a tangible reminder of how thin the margin had been between life and death. Yet even now, her mind was already pulling away from the adrenaline of the moment, toward something colder, sharper, and far more dangerous than a single act of violence. This was not the end. It was the beginning of something larger. Brian's attempt in the courtroom would dominate headlines for days, but Cole knew the real story wasn't in that one gunshot. It was in the years that led to it, the unchecked complaints, the silenced whistleblowers, the culture that let a man like him carry a badge long after he had proven unfit for it. And if a man like that had been so bold as to pull a gun in federal court, what else had he done? Certain no one would stop him? The thought settled heavily on her. There were files, records, patterns buried in ink and bureaucracy. She had seen enough in her years on the bench to recognize the outlines of a larger rot. Marcus passed by her on his way out, his face unreadable beneath the sheen of sweat on his skin. She caught his arm briefly. "You did good work today," she said. His eyes met hers for just a moment. "Wasn't just today, Judge. Been waiting years to stop that man." Cole gave a small nod, releasing him to the hallway. Around her, clerks and bailiffs began the work of restoring order, sweeping up fragments of wood, logging the damaged bench, photographing the scene. But Cole's thoughts were already beyond the walls of courtroom 2B. She imagined the paper trail, internal memos, disciplinary forms stamped unsubstantiated, body cam footage that didn't make it into evidence logs. Somewhere, someone had let Brian Kessler stay in uniform. Somewhere, decisions had been made that valued loyalty to the Shield over justice for the public. She wasn't going to let that stay hidden. Not after what had just happened, under the unforgiving glare of her courtroom lights. As the last officer left and the heavy doors closed again, sealing the silence, Judge Marissa Cole made a decision. The next morning, she would begin pulling every record tied to Brian Kessler's name. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Judge Marissa Cole's office, casting muted bars of light across the stacks of case files that had grown overnight like stubborn weeds. The smell of brewed coffee clung to the air, but the judge hadn't touched hers. It sat cooling on the corner of her desk while she bent over a spread of documents that told a story far uglier than yesterday's gunshot. Her clerk hovered by the door, clearly unsettled by the sight of so many sealed envelopes slit open and scattered like fallen leaves. "Judge, Naomi Brooks from the Eden County Ledger is here," the clerk said softly, as if afraid to disrupt the storm gathering in the room. "Send her in," Cole replied without looking up. Naomi entered with the cautious confidence of a reporter who had spent her career treading into rooms where she wasn't entirely welcome. She was tall, sharply dressed, with a recorder already in hand. Her eyes flicked over the mess of papers on Cole's desk before she took a seat. "I hear yesterday got tense," Naomi began, her voice neutral, probing. Cole met her gaze. "That's one word for it. But what I found last night is worse than a man pulling a gun in my courtroom." She slid a folder across the desk. "Read the headers." Naomi flipped it open, her brows knitting together as she scanned the pages. "Complaint for excessive force. 2011, citizen alleges racial slurs and broken ribs." Status dismissed. She turned a page. Same year, domestic disturbance. Victim recants. Case dropped. Her fingers hesitated on the next file. 2014, 2 minors injured during a stop and frisk. Unsubstantiated. There's more, Cole said, her voice flattening into something colder. 10 years' worth of lost evidence, vanished body cam footage, cases reassigned before they could be reviewed. And it's not just street-level incidents. Immigration detainees, black teenagers, even a complaint from a fellow officer. Who buried this? Naomi asked. That's what I intend to find out. The door opened again, this time without a knock. Detective Carla Jensen stepped in, holding a manila envelope and looking like she hadn't slept. Carla had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize the weight of file before even reading it. She placed the envelope on the desk. This came from a contact in internal affairs. Carla said, "It's not supposed to exist. A full disciplinary record for Kessler, names, dates, incidents. None of it ever made it into the public database." Naomi leaned forward, eyes scanning the new set of papers. Jesus, this is systemic. Look here. There's a memo from a deputy DA advising the department to handle the matter internally to avoid political fallout. And here, a captain's note about Kessler being too valuable to lose. Cole rose from her chair and crossed to the corkboard mounted on the far wall. It was nearly bare an hour ago, but now red yarn stretched between pinned photographs, printed emails, and sticky notes scribbled with names. With each new revelation, Carla and Naomi watched her add another pin, another connection. A former police chief's smiling headshot was linked to an internal affairs supervisor, whose name in turn led to a local prosecutor with an impeccable public record and a private habit of making complaints disappear. The web grew, spanning over a decade of quiet cover-ups. Naomi exhaled sharply. This isn't a chain of accidents. It's deliberate. They've been protecting him because he's willing to do their dirty work. Cole's expression didn't change, but her voice carried the weight of judgment. Brian Kessler was never just a road cop. He's a product of a system designed to shield men like him. Carla nodded grimly. You know what that means, Judge. If you take him down, you're not just hitting one man. You're shaking the whole tree. And whatever's in that tree won't fall quietly. For a moment, silence took hold, broken only by the faint hum of the courthouse HVAC. Cole stared at the board, tracing the web with her eyes. She thought of the witnesses silenced, the victims discredited. The communities told their pain was a misunderstanding. Naomi finally spoke, voice low. People will want to know why you're digging this deep. Are you ready for what they'll say about you? Cole turned from the board. I've been black and a woman in this job for long enough to know they'll say plenty. But I also know what silence costs. And I'm done paying that price. She reached for her phone, her hand steady despite the enormity of the decision forming in her mind. Carla, I'll need you to arrange a secure interview room at the detention center. Naomi, you'll get your story, but not yet. I need to hear it from him first, from a man they've been protecting for over a decade. Carla's brow lifted. You think he'll talk? I think, Cole said, that when a man like Brian realizes the system he thought had his back is cracking, he might say more than he means to. Naomi leaned back in her chair, recorder still in her hand, though she hadn't pressed play once since arriving. Sound like you're about to light a match in a very dry forest. Cole glanced at the corkboard again, the red threads pulsing like a map of arteries, feeding something rotten at its core. If that's what it takes to burn the rot out, so be it. The office felt smaller now, the walls closing in under the weight of what they'd uncovered. Outside the window, the courthouse square bustled with the morning rush, oblivious to the fact that a network of lies and protection had just been pulled into the light, at least in this room. Naomi gathered her notes. Carla tucked the sealed envelope under her arm, and the clerk reappeared to take instructions for clearing Cole's afternoon docket. The judge was already making a mental list. What questions to ask, how to corner him without tipping her hand, which threads to pull until the whole web unraveled. This was no longer about yesterday's near-death moment in court. It was about the years before it, the lives upended and forgotten, the trust eroded grain by grain until the people most in need of protection learned to expect the opposite. As Naomi and Carla left, Cole remained at the window, watching the city go about its business. Somewhere in the county jail, Brian Kessler was likely pacing, certain that his friends in high places were already working on his release. He had no idea those friends had just been exposed, at least to her. She turned back to her desk, her resolve set. There would be no more sealed envelopes, no more handled internally, no more lives erased in the margins of police reports. Cole decided to face Brian in the county jail. The visitation room of the city jail smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale air, a scent that clung to the cinder block walls like a warning. Judge Marissa Cole stepped through the heavy steel door, the muffled buzz of its magnetic lock fading as it sealed behind her. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, washing the room in a sterile glow that made everything feel both too real and somehow drained of life. Brian Kessler sat on the other side of the scratched plexiglass partition, wrists cuffed in front of him, chains threaded through a metal loop bolted to the floor. The orange jumpsuit couldn't quite erase the arrogance in his posture. He lounged in a chair like he was waiting for a delayed flight, rather than facing the collapse of his life. "Well, if it isn't the hero of the day," he said, his voice dripping with mockery the moment Cole sat down. "The judge who survived the big bad wolf." His smirk widened. "You here to gloat?" "No," Cole replied evenly, folding her hands on the table. "I'm here because you've been at the center of something much larger than your own crimes, and I want to know how far it goes." He leaned closer to the glass, eyes narrowing in theatrical suspicion. "That sounds like curiosity, Judge. Dangerous thing, curiosity. Sometimes you dig too deep, and you end up buried yourself." Cole didn't flinch. "You've been protected for over a decade. Complaints vanished, evidence disappeared, victims silenced. That kind of protection doesn't happen without people above you pulling the strings. I want their names." Brian chuckled, the sound low and smug. "So that's why you're here. You think I'm just going to hand you the keys to the kingdom? No, no, no. You want the list? We make a deal. Reduced sentence. Maybe I see daylight again before I'm 50. Cole studied him for a long moment. The man across from her had tried to kill her less than 48 hours ago, and yet here he was, speaking as if they were negotiating a real estate contract. His confidence was almost believable, almost. "You walked into my courtroom with a gun," she said, her voice cool but edged with steel. "You threatened to execute the sitting judge in front of a dozen witnesses and a room full of cameras. And you think you're in a position to bargain." Brian tilted his head, an ugly grin spreading across his face. "Lady, you think my little stunt is why I'm in here? That's small potatoes. The people you want, the real players, they'll walk unless I talk. And if I keep my mouth shut, you'll never touch them. That's the truth, whether you like it or not." Cole leaned forward just enough that the reflection of her eyes cut through the glare on the glass. "You seem to think the only way I can bring them down is through you. You're wrong. I've already got enough to start unraveling their network. And when I do, you'll just be another link in a chain that snapped. You won't get to be the star witness. You won't get to control the story." For the first time, Brian's smirk faltered. A flicker, a thin, unguarded slice of something that might have been unease, passed over his face. "You're bluffing," he said, but the edge in his voice betrayed him. "No," Cole replied. "I'm telling you exactly what's going to happen. Every single person who used their badge, their office, or their position to shield you will stand where you sat. They'll hear the charges read against them, and the public will see their names in black and white. And they'll remember who you are, not as some loyal soldier, but as a criminal who thought he could outgun justice." Brian's hands tightened around the chain between his cuffs. "You don't get it, do you? These people, they don't lose. They make the rules. And when they're done with you, you won't even—" "I've spent my life in rooms where people told me they make the rules," Cole cut in, her voice firm enough to still the air between them. "The truth is rules change, and they're about to." For a long moment, neither spoke. Somewhere down the hall, a guard's radio crackled with static, then silence. Brian broke first, a laugh escaping him, short, humorless, but loud enough to bounce off the walls. "You think you're scary, Judge? You're just stubborn. But stubborn gets people hurt." He leaned back, his chains clinking. "Still, maybe you're not as predictable as I thought." Cole rose from her chair, collecting her folder from the table. "We're done here." "You'll be back," Brian called after her, his tone shifting from confident to something that almost sounded like hope disguised as arrogance. "When you realize you can't win without me." She paused at the door, turning just enough to meet his eyes. "The difference between us, Mr. Kessler, is that I don't need you to win, and that's why you're afraid." Brian's grin returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. This time, the fear didn't flicker, it lingered. The guard opened the door, and Cole stepped back into the corridor, the echo of the lock snapping shut behind her. The weight of the conversation settled over her, not as doubt, but as confirmation. He did have the names, but he wasn't the only source. And his fear meant one thing. He knew the walls were closing in faster than his allies could tear them down. Outside, the winter sun was sharp and cold, the kind that made the air feel like glass. Cole breathed it in, each step from the jail sharpening her resolve. She had the files. She had the network mapped. And she had no intention of giving Brian Kessler the dignity of being the one to save himself. Cole presented the file to the State Oversight Committee. The public hearing chamber at the state capitol was never designed for catharsis. It was meant for statements read into the record, for measured answers and procedural clarity. Yet by mid-morning, the room pulsed like a living thing. Packed aisles, cameras threaded through clusters of residents, and the layered murmur of people who had waited years to be believed. On the dais, the seal of the state glinted under television lights. Beside it, the gavel of the Oversight Committee's chair rested within easy reach, a quiet reminder that order could be called but not guaranteed. Judge Marissa Cole sat at the front table, files stacked in precise columns, a map of a decade's rot arranged to the public eye. To her left, the committee chair, a silver-haired former attorney known for cool decorum, shuffled a stack of subpoenas. To her right, Special Prosecutor Leonard Price adjusted his tie with a fastidiousness that failed to hide the strain in his jaw. He had built a career on polish, press-ready sentences, steady approval ratings, but the documents Cole had delivered were a solvent, and his varnish was already starting to lift. The first witnesses were called in rapid succession. A Haitian shopkeeper described a night stop that became a beating, his accent thickening as he recounted how his son begged an officer to stop while the body cam malfunctioned. A nurse from the South Side spoke of a search that left her children cowering in a hallway, a report later stamped unfounded despite photographs and ER charts. A college student, now 23, described the ache that settled in her ribs after a compliance hold, and an email from Internal Affairs warning her that filing a second complaint could complicate her scholarship. None said Brian Kessler's name first. They didn't have to. It arrived on its own, like a reflexive whence the room already recognized. Cole did not interrupt, did not perform. She let the record breathe and calcify. Each testimony another vertebra in a spine the city would have to stand on. When the shopkeeper's hands trembled, she passed him water. When the nurse faltered, she asked only one gentle question to center the timeline. She spoke rarely, and when she did, it was in the tight cadence of someone repairing a ship while at sea. Locate the breach, seal it with facts, move to the next failure. Then the committee called Officer Ethan Ward. He was young enough to be mistaken for a cadet until the moment he took the oath, broad-shouldered, close-cropped, eyes that carried the fatigue of night shifts that never quite ended. He sat, cleared his throat once, and lifted his chin toward the dais. "Officer Ward," the chair said, "do you understand the potential professional consequences of your testimony?" "Yes, sir," Ward replied. "I understand." "Proceed." Ward's voice didn't crack. It tightened. "I joined the department 3 years ago because I believed service meant keeping people safe. On my 3rd month, I rode patrol with Sergeant Kessler. We stopped a black teenager walking home from his shift at a pizza place. The kid had flour on his shoes. Sergeant Kessler told me to write him up for loitering and obstruction when he asked why he was being detained." Ward swallowed. When I hesitated, he said, "You want a career here, learn the difference between them and us." A rustle rolled across the chamber. Cameras angled forward in a synchronized crouch. "What did you do?" the chair asked. "I wrote the warning," Ward said, shame-plain and uncamouflaged. "I told myself it was just a warning. Later, I filed a supplemental report documenting the stop. That report never appeared in the system. When I asked the supervisor, I was told, "Get with the program, rookie." He reached into a folder and held up a printed email thread. "This is the chain where I asked where my report went. It's time-stamped. The reply says I must have misfiled it and that the matter was handled internally." He placed it on the evidence cart. I was also copied on an email from the division to the DA's office, asking for guidance on press inquiries about Sergeant Kessler complaints. The response said, "Do not engage. We anticipate no fallout." Leonard Price shifted, but not quickly enough to avoid the committee's gaze. Cole turned toward him, patience flaking away from her composure. "Mr. Price," she said evenly, "is that your office's correspondence?" Price lifted the mic. "Judge Cole, with respect, I cannot comment on ongoing matters. You can confirm whether that domain is yours." He glanced at the header, then nodded. "It appears to be." "Would you read the signatory line?" she asked. He hesitated. "Leonard A. Price, Special Prosecutor." The room absorbed it in silence. Cole did not raise her voice. "And when you wrote, 'We anticipate no fallout,' what warnings had you already received about Sergeant Kessler?" "Your Honor," he began, and then checked himself. Remembering titles were not currency here. "Judge Cole, some complaints lack corroboration, and as you know, my office must allocate attention based on prosecutable cases." "Prosecutable is not the same as invisible," Cole replied. "How many times did community members send affidavits that never became cases because your office classified them as non-viable?" Price's jaw tensed. "We acted within policy. Policy that permitted an officer to accumulate more than a dozen serious allegations without a single hearing? Policy that treated entire neighborhoods as unreliable narrators of their own injuries." Cole leaned an inch closer. "Say the quiet part out loud. You weighted credibility by zip code, by accent, by skin." A collective inhale. "I will not accept that characterization," Price said, but there was a hairline fracture in his tone. "Officer Ward." Cole pivoted, refusing to let the moment dissipate. "Did you ever raise concerns beyond your chain of command?" "I did," Ward said quietly. "I contacted Internal Affairs twice and the Union once. The IA investigator said I was young and might be misreading experienced tactics. The Union rep told me, 'Don't make trouble. The public doesn't understand what we do.' On the second IA call, I was told to stop using my city email for sensitive complaints. After that, my patrol schedule changed. I was put on rotating overnight parking enforcement." "You were sidelined," Cole said. "Yes, ma'am." Ward turned to the gallery, not his performance, but because the people there were the ones he had been told to avoid seeing. "I'm white," he said, voice steady. "I get to take this uniform off. But the people who filed those complaints, they never get to take off what made them a target. I'm here because I took an oath too." Price's pen stilled. The chair's gavel tapped once, not for silence, but to mark the moment for the record, as if to say, this was the point where the wall cracked. Cole slid a new exhibit to the clerk: emails, memos, routing slips with missing attachments. "Mr. Price, let's be clear. You received at least 4 flagged referrals about Kessler from IA in 2018 and 2019. Here are the intake stamps." She pointed to the date. "And here is your office's response. Insufficient basis to proceed. Did anyone in your office interview the complainants?" Price's answer faltered. I cannot confirm from memory." "That's why I brought your calendar," Cole said, producing a printout with empty blocks where follow-up should have been. "There were no interviews. You punted the ball back to the department, which returned it to you with the same conclusion. In the meantime, Kessler remained on duty." A murmur of anger rippled through the back rows. Tight, controlled, a community refusing to be scolded for volume while watching their lives reduced to paperwork. The chair leaned into his mic. "Counselor Price," he said, "the committee expects immediate production of all IA referrals and your office's disposition notes for the relevant period. We also request a policy describing what constitutes insufficient basis in cases alleging excessive force and racial animus." Price nodded stiffly. "We will comply." "No!" The chair said, the softness in his voice dropping away. You will comply today. Cole's final witness of the morning was brief. A data analyst who mapped the geographic concentration of dismissed complaints against Kessler and 2 of his supervisors. The clusters were unmistakable. South Side apartments, immigrant corridors west of the river, 3 blocks bordering the public housing towers. The dots glowed on the monitors like a constellation of neglect. The chair looked out over the chamber, absorbing the density of it all. The first-hand injuries, the vanished files, the emails that said a quiet part in clean bureaucratic prose. He lifted the gavel and spoke into the hush. This committee recognizes a credible pattern of systemic failure involving the Eden County Police Department, Internal Affairs, and the Special Prosecutor's Office. Effective immediately, we are issuing subpoenas for records, suspending the implicated personnel pending investigation, and appointing an independent monitor. For a split second, no one moved. Then the room exhaled into sound, some cheers, some sobs, some stunned silence that communicated relief wrapped in grief. Cole did not celebrate. She watched Leonard Price, who stared at the middle distance as if trying to reorganize a world that had refused for once to arrange itself around him. She spoke once more, not to the committee but to the people who had filled the chamber and the overflow rooms and the sidewalks outside. This hearing is not closure, she said. It is a hinge. What comes next will measure whether we are capable of reform or only of apology. The hook found its mark. The pressure in the room, public, political, moral, coalesced into a single demand. Act now. The chair nodded to his clerk, who carried a thick envelope to the dais. By late afternoon, the envelope's contents were scanned, stamped, and filed. A clerk stepped before the microphones, voice steady as she read the names. The city shook as the list of implicated officials was made public. The verdict arrived not with fanfare, but with the kind of hush that rearranges a room. 12 people filed back into the jury box, faces unreadable, shoulders square by the weight of what they were about to say. The clock over the bench ticked softly, indifferent to history. Brian Kessler sat at counsel table in a county issue suit, the crisp edges of authority long since frayed. His gaze zigzagged between the jurors and the floor, as if seeking a seeming reality he could still pry open. Madam Foreperson, the judge presiding asked, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have." One by one, the counts were read: aggravated assault, obstruction, falsification of reports, deprivation of rights under color law, firearms offenses tied to the attack in courtroom 2B. On each, the same 2 words landed with the finality of a door shutting. Guilty, guilty, guilty. There was no recommendation for leniency, no escape hatch for time served, no softening language about tragic circumstances. The law, having been twisted for years into a shield, had finally acted as a measure. At the rear of the courtroom, Judge Marissa Cole sat among the public. No robe, no bench, no elevation. She'd refused the symbolic seat offered to her on the dais out of respect for the judge who had taken over the case, and out of fidelity to the principle she repeated to herself like a vow. This was not her victory to star in. It belonged to the record, to the witnesses who hadn't been believed, to the communities that had waited for the system to speak a language they recognized as justice. Kessler didn't flinch when the sentence was read, a term long enough to mark an era without the possibility of parole or administrative clemency. He blinked once, whether from disbelief or calculation was impossible to tell, then laced his fingers together on the table, as if bracing for a tide. The bailiff's hand settled on his shoulder, not harshly, but with unarguable direction. He stood, glanced toward the gallery as if hoping to find a sympathetic eye, and found only a wall of faces resolved into something stronger than anger, a collective insistence that what had been done in their name would no longer be done without answer. Outside, the courthouse steps vibrated with overlapping currents. Cameras hummed. Microphones sprouted like reeds along the barricades. Neighbors who had never met clasped each other's hands and exhaled tension they'd carried for years. The signs were different now. Fewer slogans, more commitments. Independent oversight now. Data, not excuses. Protect the people who report. A folding table appeared near the statue at the foot of the stairs. Within an hour it had become a hub, a sign-up sheet for the newly formed Civilian Oversight Board, a QR code for language access volunteers, a box labeled Youth Advisory Council, ages 14 to 21. People lined up not for a photo, but for responsibility. Charleston that afternoon felt like a city taking inventory of its conscience. At the community center on Ash Street, a free legal clinic rotated interpreters in Haitian Creole and Spanish. A retired public defender sketched out a Know Your Rights workshop, while a high school civics teacher arranged chairs for a youth forum that would not end with a bell. Up the block, a barbershop hosted a listening session with off-duty officers and neighborhood elders. No cameras, no grandstanding, just a whiteboard titled, What Safety Should Feel Like. At the church gym, folding tables buckled under the weight of donated laptops. A local university's data lab had matched volunteers with the city's open records portal. The first project, a public dashboard tracking misconduct complaints and disciplinary outcomes, took shape over pizza boxes and shared chargers. A software engineer taped a handmade sign above the doorway. If it isn't measured, it isn't mended. In the corner, a group of mothers drafted a policy proposal for trauma-informed responses to school incidents. They were joined by a guidance counselor who offered to coordinate training with the district. No ribbon-cutting marked the new Civilian Oversight Board's inaugural meeting. The work started in a library conference room that smelled faintly of dust and optimism. By late evening, members had voted to subpoena historic internal affairs records, require public reporting of closed cases, and establish a whistleblower protection pipeline independent of both the department and the prosecutor's office. An elder from the west side reminded the room, gently, that transparency without repair could become another kind of harm. The board added a line item: restorative meetings for families harmed by prior misconduct, opt-in, survivor-led, with resources attached. Judge Cole moved quietly among these spaces, neither in front nor apart. At the youth forum, a student asked if one case could really change anything. Cole didn't sermonize. She spoke about hinges, the small ones that allow heavy doors to move. The verdict is a hinge, she said, not a destination. The door still needs pushing every day. Back at the courthouse, Special Prosecutor Jordan Lee faced reporters who wanted an ending. She refused to give them one. We will not sell catharsis, she said into the microphones. Prosecutions are necessary, not sufficient. We're auditing failure points. Intake standards that discounted whole neighborhoods, evidence protocols that made disappearance easy, union contracts that turned accountability into arbitration. Behind her, representatives from the independent monitor's office took notes in real time, not waiting for a press cycle to pass. Across town, Officer Ethan Ward, no longer probationary presence on the margins, sat in a circle at the barbershop listening session, hands open on his knees. He didn't ask for absolution. He asked for instructions. A pastor told him to start with his rookies. And Annie from Rivers Avenue said, "Show up when there isn't a camera." A young man who had testified at the hearing said, "Make your reports public when the policy says you can't. Then help us change the policy." Ward nodded, not like a man collecting praise, but like one receiving a job. In the swirl of recap articles and live shots, the cameras kept angling toward Cole. She sidestepped them. When a national outlet asked for an exclusive, she handed them a list of community leaders and told them to start there. When a morning show invited her to do a victory lap, she declined and sent a memo to the state judiciary recommending a bench-wide review of how judges handle sealed misconduct files that affect credibility determinations. In a city that suddenly had more heroes than it knew how to frame, she insisted on center mechanics over myth. In a small park ringed by live oaks, a circle gathered with candles they didn't light. They read the names of complainants whose affidavits had once been filed and forgotten. A teenager, one of the students who had lined up to join the Youth Advisory Council, stepped forward and read a line she had written on a scrap of notebook paper. "We can't unbruise the old nights, but we can build mornings where nobody has to learn how to breathe around a knee." No one applauded. They stood in the silence, her words requested. As night fell, the courthouse dome caught the last light and held it. A janitor on the late shift paused to run his hand over the gouge in the courtroom bench where the bullet had lodged months earlier. He had thought about requesting a replacement plank. He decided to leave it for now, a scar that told the truth without spectacle. Charleston did not transform overnight. Policies moved through committee at the speed of government. Lawsuits wound their way through dockets. The Oversight Board's first subpoenas met with predictable resistance and some surprising cooperation. The dashboard went live with more gaps than data points, then filled in as the public demanded the rest. The department announced a lateral entry program that prioritized experienced officers trained in de-escalation. Activists asked what would prevent the wrong officers from lateraling in. The conversation kept refusing to end at the press conference, which, for the first time in a long while, felt like progress. On the morning the prison bus took Brian Kessler out of county custody, a light rain freckled the windshield. He didn't look back. The city did not follow him to the gate. Its attention was elsewhere: committee rooms, classrooms, church basements, code repositories, places where cultures made granularly, stubbornly, and without applause. In the courthouse atrium, a small plaque appeared weeks later. Not a hero's bust, not a bronze ideal. It read, "In recognition of those who testified when silence was safer, and those who listened when comfort was easier." Someone taped a handwritten line beneath it, the ink a little smudged in the damp air. Justice does not arrive on its own. It is built, piece by piece, by acts of courage, even the smallest. Judge Cole walked past the plaque on her way to a meeting with the Independent Monitor. A young clerk stopped her to ask for a photo. She smiled, thanked them, and declined. There was a draft policy on her desk that needed 3 more amendments to become useful instead of merely well-intentioned. Her calendar held a community roundtable on language access in court filings. The work hummed, unglamorous and necessary. Outside, the city sounded different, not quieter, not louder, but tuned, grievances moving alongside designs, resistance braided with construction. A hinge had turned, and enough hands had gathered to keep the door from swinging shut. The story closes, and yet it opens, toward a long chapter change that would demand vigilance, humility, and the daily labor of making justice ordinary. And just like that, a man who thought he was untouchable was led away in cuffs, his arrogance replaced with silence. The trial didn't just end with a verdict. It peeled back the curtain on a system that had been protecting him for years. But the question is, how many more like him are still out there, waiting for their day in court? If you believe stories like this need to be told, hit that like button, share this video so more people see it, and subscribe for the next chapter in the fight for justice.